Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour then, we'll see what's making the headlines this evening with the Evening Standard columnist, Ayesha Hazarika, and the Sun's political editor, Tom Newton-Dunn. Welcome to both of you, good to see you. So as ever at this point, let's see what the front pages hold. As you might expect, it is the budget on most of them. The Telegraph then reports on what's arguably been the most headline-grabbing policy, the abolition of stamp duty on the first 300,000 of first-time home buyers' purchases. The Eye calls it Hammond's hard hat budget, highlighting that many of the measures have faced criticism today. Perhaps unsurprisingly, The Guardian is among the sceptics, though, with their headline, Hammond struggles to lift the gloom. The Mirror's assessment is ever more blunt. They say, thanks for nothing. The Metro opting for a new pun, now fill in the gaps amid suggestions the Chancellor's sums don't add up. The Express focuses on the £3 billion pot of money, which it says has been set aside to ensure a speedy Brexit. The Times suggests it was a budget that finally began to make the turn away from austerity. The Mail takes back its Eeyore nickname for the Chancellor, but warns he should still be worried about debt. The Financial Times there says the London Metal Exchange probes child labour concerns over cobalt. I think there's a newer version of that, though. Well, Ayesha Hazarika and Tom Newton-Dunn are here. So, what did you think?
Well, do you know what? It was supposed to be a very boring day, and actually there wasn't anything dramatically new in what the Chancellor announced today. Fine, a fairly interesting miniature rabbit, little baby bunny rabbit on stamp duty break abolition for all first-time buyers, but everything we really could have predicted or thought. But yet, strangely, I find myself really rather interested by this entire budget, despite the fact I spent the last 10 hours trying to get my head around it, because the politics behind it, I suppose it is, and to make it interesting on shows like this, but generally the politics behind what was happening today is absolutely fascinating, and we've gone for the Times front pages. I think the way to sum this up today, Hammond eases off austerity. This is a man who prides himself on being known as Fiscal Phil. He may be a bit dull, but he's a very tough bookkeeper. He keeps his hands strongly on the purse strings of Whitehall. He's made his name across Whitehall departments in his career, the Foreign Office, certainly the MOD, in cutting costs and being very fiscally tight. And today, what did he do? He spent £25 billion of taxpayers' money and money he's going to have to borrow on stuff that, quite frankly, we probably really can't afford. The budget red book is basically all the money that goes in, all the money goes out, and there's a huge, great 25 billion in the red there. Normally, budgets try to be balanced, so what you spend, you take, and it's fiscally neutral, as they call it. This one is extraordinary. He's gone from Fiscal Phil to spend it like Corbyn.
Well, look, in some ways, you can argue that austerity is over, because the mantra always was we just simply cannot borrow anymore, and we have these very strict targets about when we're going to pay off the deficit. George Osborne, the previous Chancellor, had set those targets. They have now essentially been ripped up. So in that sense, yes, the sort of old orthodoxy of austerity is gone. But politics is all about choices. There's a finite amount of money, and it's what you spend the money on.
So what was missing for you?
Well, for the big thing that was missing for me was social care. Social care continues to be a huge pressing issue for families up and down this country. It's a real life issue, and there was nothing about social care
They couldn't even agree on that, in a manifesto before a general election. In a minority government, how can you possibly start to delve anywhere near an issue
I think
like
he
that?
would have got cross-party support for putting more money into social care, because that is something which every single party has signed up to. Now, the baby bunny that was pulled out at the end was this stamp duty thing, and I think that is the thing that's going to slightly unravel. Now, some will argue this is a great bonanza for first-time buyers, but actually what a lot of experts are saying, that this is actually going to slightly have an unintended consequence and push up house prices.
So the Office for Budget Responsibility is saying that they pointed to an HMRC study about stamp duty holidays, which meant that this would slightly push up prices. One wonders if that study was done during a rising market, and certainly in London and the South East, arguably the most overheated parts of the housing market, growth has fallen. And so would it have the same impact? That's the only thing I put out there.
It's basic economics, and the Chancellor and the Treasury tonight arguing quite patchy. They think the OBR have got this wrong, this concept that basically it's a supply and demand. If you increase demand by basically making it easier to people to buy houses, more houses they'll want to buy, and it will push up the prices of houses. But the Chancellor and the Treasury argue what the OBR have failed to do entirely is take into account all the effect that their measures today are having on supply. So they're arguing this is going to dramatically push up the number of houses being built. I contest that, to be honest, because by their own estimate, this is only going to get to this magic 300,000 figure, which is the amount we need every year, by 2025. Now, some may say that's halfway through Jeremy Corbyn's first term in government, if the next general election really is in 2022. So I question that. But any which way you look at it, it's an interesting move, but quite frankly, it's the only rabbit also, so it's the one we're all talking about, but it really isn't that much of a big rabbit.
We'll come back to housing when we get to that in the newspapers. Let's go on to the Financial Times, shall we, which does lay down the difficulties, which is really the growth forecast. Productivity growth, business investment, GDP, all revised downwards, which is very difficult for the Chancellor.
Very, very difficult, a very sobering set of results. And actually, when one works for the Leader of the Opposition, these figures are where you can chant all the growth forecasts down, down, down. So this is very worrying for the economy. I think a lot of people have some deep anxiety about this, particularly because we've got the sort of elephant in the room with Brexit coming down the track as well. So I think whatever kind of mild bits of cheer you can find, whether you want to sort of say, look, this stamp duty thing is very good, the big stain that is hanging over this, the sort of cloud over this budget, are these very, very dark growth figures.
They really were bad. So we've known for a few weeks that the Office of Budget Responsibility was going to downgrade productivity, in other words, the output the economy manages to do, because it's been flatlining for an awful long time now. That hits growth. What we didn't know is quite how much growth it was going to take off the numbers, how much less GDP we're going to be making every year.
Still more than was predicted last November, though, isn't it? It's just less than March. So these things clearly fluctuate. And the worst could be we could be in negative growth. You know, we could be.
They do,
looking at recession.
and here's the thing: Brexit hasn't actually happened yet. So what Philip Hammond did a year ago,
but the
autumn
uncertainty
statement,
is there, you might argue.
It is, and what Philip Hammond did a year ago, the autumn statement. Remember, he was accused of being very gloomy. He said, "I'm going to have to store away £26 billion as a rainy day war chest in case Brexit goes very badly." Right-wing Tory MPs, Brexiteer Tory MPs didn't like him at all for doing that. This year, a year on, he's spent it all. Literally, 25 out of the 26 billion he spent on, and it's not on massive reforms. Ayesha's absolutely right. It's not on social care or fixing the very lopsided pension system that is very good for old people, not so good for young people. It's on problems the government have, such as universal credit, such as NHS funding, business rates coming around next April. People are going to get hit very badly by that, small firms. So none of this is big reforms. But this sort of budget, this sort of massive spending budget we've just seen, you normally get these just before a general election, not just after. Budgets just after general elections, they're all about putting up taxes and being tough.
I'm just looking at the Mac cartoon. If we go to the front page of the Telegraph, actually, you'll probably struggle to see it, but it does say no more than 2 young people at any time, with 2 people outside an estate agent's, which is often outside a newsagent's. You get that, don't you, after school. Helping hand for first-time buyers, they've gone there. Down the bottom as well. Outlook is gloomy, but there to be proved wrong. Who knows what will happen? That's kind of the point,
that's the actual point there that we were talking about. Yeah. The OBI has to be said, we all attach huge amounts by these forecasts. I can't remember a single year of covering all these budgets now in a decade where the forecasts haven't been wrong. They're wrong every year. The problem is the Chancellor has to plan on something, and if the OBR says it's going to be bad, then he has to plan for bad.
But I think if you look at the bigger politics, what kind of going back to what Tom said, remember, this is an important budget. This is the first budget since the snap general election, since, the Tories may not have won this big majority, but since they have retained power. And what's missing from this? I mean, there is a lot of money that's been sort of thrown about and the cash has been splashed a bit, but there's still no political narrative. There is still no political vision that the Conservatives are setting out, saying to the people of Britain, look, for the next 5 years, here's our big, plan for society, here's the kind of people we want to sort of help. It's still quite piecemeal, a little bit for maths, a little bit for the health service, a little bit for first-time buyers. There isn't that big kind of thing that people are looking for, the sort of existential, or rather the Brexistential crisis.
Brexit looms, and if we look at the Daily Express, Brexit did it get the most money? It certainly got more than the health service, didn't it?
I'd say very briefly, I'd slightly disagree with Ayesha, that there is a bit of a plan that Hammond unveiled today. We've been talking about the last few days. It's huge amounts of spending on infrastructure, skills, technology, driverless cars, all that sort of stuff. It's all slightly tedious, but it is precisely the sort of thing that that the Chancellor thinks is going to solve the productivity problem. The problem is it's not a great thing to sell. It's not going to catch people by the short and curlies and get them very overexcited.
The thing that I thought was missing, I thought he would have been much more political. So, for example, public sector workers, many Conservative voters actually switched to Labour because they were so dismayed with the public sector pay cap, firefighters, paramedics, teachers, nurses. Nothing for them. And on the infrastructure stuff, infrastructure is incredibly important. You know, a Chancellor never loses or gets criticised for investing in infrastructure. But again, not enough money to the north either, you know, in terms of looking at sort of disparity across the region. So I think there were obvious things he could have done, but he's missed them and gone for piecemeal things.
Well, he mentioned the Northern Powerhouse again, the Midlands engine, was it? I can't remember.
Midlands engine.
Engine, yes.
Northern Powerhouse, Midlands engine, Southern, we
But
haven't got one
you know,
yet.
there's areas like Yorkshire, there's areas like Yorkshire which are saying they feel that they've really, really missed out.
Yeah. And just a word about the Brexit spending. Daily Express selling it as $3 billion to speed up Brexit. Where's this money for?
This is very interesting. This is really entirely the Chancellor on the back foot here. Do you remember it was only a month ago, just after Tory conference, there was an almighty row between basically the Chancellor and people like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, getting very angry indeed with him because he hasn't spent enough to prepare for Brexit. He hadn't spent anything at all. So
and he said he wouldn't, didn't
quickly, they rushed out about 600 or 700 million that he'd now said he was going to give to the departments. Now, and this is over the next 2 years, an extra 3 billion. None of this is necessarily allocated. They don't know what it's going to go on. The one thing I don't think it will do, and I hate to disagree with Daily Express, is speed anything up at all. Brexit is going at the snail's pace that we're now used to, and an extra 3 billion ain't going to buy you more time.
We'll see, we'll see. Still to come, we will be taking a look at the choices facing Angela Merkel. Back in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Ayesha Hazarika and Dunn. It's been windy all day, hasn't it? It's not just now.
It's quite fitting.
Yeah,
It's sort of tremendous storm blowing through Westminster.
So it's all the hot air, it's all the bluster coming out of like the chamber.
Somebody's over the back door.
Exactly, it's all the bluster coming out of the Commons.
At that moment, there was a gust just to prove our point. Anyway, back to the Financial Times. Jokes aside, it says, who are we talking about, I wonder?
This is fiscal funny fill now. So this was, again, another very interesting part of the entire budget day, despite the fact we've already agreed there isn't a huge amount necessarily fascinating, no great big reforms to the budget. And that was his entire budget delivery. We are very used to Philip Hammond being a slightly ponderous, slightly arrogant man with very little humility at all, who's absolutely convinced he's right about everything and feels no need to make people laugh or bring him along with them. Today, it was vaudeville. His entire speech, about an hour long, was full of generally quite funny jokes. He even had this sort of strange cabaret act with the Prime Minister at one stage where she handed him cough sweets like he handed her cough sweets during the famous disastrous conference speech. There's a good gag about Michael Gove, who's apparently was quoted by another cabinet minister the other day for using too many long economic-y words in cabinet.
As if he's auditioning.
Auditioning for Philip Hammond's job. So he talked about, right, here come the growth forecasts, and just so you know, this is where I use the long, big economic-y words, making a joke about Michael Gove. And the whole thing was quite good. He even admitted at one stage that he basically got this appalling gaffe about the unemployed wrong on Sunday. So it was a light-hearted Phil, very, very hard trying to win over his Tory MPs sitting behind him, with 300 Tory MPs who really don't like him. He desperately needs their support to keep him in the job, and I think he did a pretty good job of it.
So the lady who is a stand-up comic stood to your right. Was it good, or was it quite good?
Well, I don't know if we'll be seeing like Phil closing the Comedy Store at any point too. But look, in the chamber, very low. Look, the level of humour is low in the chamber, and I know that because I used to write jokes for the chamber. It's a very, very low bar. But what it is, and on certain occasions like Prime Minister's Questions and Budget Day, that chamber becomes a piece of theatre, that becomes a stage. And what the audience want is they want some passion, they want sharp, memorable lines, and they do want a bit of humour. And that expression, God loves a trier, is never more appropriate than from when it's a budget day or a PMQs. They want their boss who's standing at the dispatch box to give them something to cheer, to give them something to jeer. So I think any attempts at humour always go down quite well. And look, some of the jokes were all right. Like I say, the bar is low, but it's important if you're at the dispatch box on a big occasion like that to try and get some jokes in. And I'll tell you something, in the prep for conference, in the prep for that speech, they will have spent a lot of time working on the jokes.
OK. Inside the Times, two important world news stories, foreign stories. First of all, on Germany, Merkel's ratings slide to a record low, it says in the middle of that paper.
A really interesting story. Meanwhile, the world moves on as we discuss our budget. And of course, Germany is currently in the middle of an almighty mess that really makes our government here, our minority government, look almost functionable. So, of course, we're now almost certainly heading to new German elections after
Well, only because they
Merkel's.
have coalition government. We've had to try and have a coalition government, which we don't normally have.
Well,
but-
normally, this is the thing about Germany. They're normally very good at forming coalitions. They have to do it all the time because their electoral system is different to ours. But Merkel spent the last month and a half trying to form a coalition government, failing spectacularly. So we're almost certainly now looking at new elections probably in January. And some fascinating polling in Germany now that Merkel and her party, the CDU, effectively the German Conservatives, are at an all-time low. They're today polling below 30%. They're on 29%, and I think they got about 34%. I got that wrong, roughly 34% during the German elections. Now, this means that two things. A, she will almost certainly do worse in a new election. But B, the pressure is now on her hugely to perhaps move aside, get someone else in to freshen up the CDU's appeal and try and keep them in power.
We've only got a minute left. Zimbabwe, do you want to do? Or...
Yeah, very important moment for Zimbabwe. We've got Mnangagwa, I can't say something. Emerson, the vice president, are taking over.
I am your servant.
I am your servant. Well, look,
Also
this is
the
a very
Times.
exciting new moment for Zimbabwe. But beware, this is the man who's also known as the crocodile, and he had a very big role in Zimbabwe's very violent and blood-soaked past. So I think it is good that Mugabe has gone. But I agree with Morgan Chandirai, the former Prime Minister, that the way for Zimbabwe to flourish is to have free, fair and proper democratic elections.
And very quickly, you wanted to mention a theatrical blackout as
Yes,
well.
there was. At the new, lovely, shiny Bridge Theatre in London, which is an incredible theatre, and I went to see Young Marks there a couple of weeks ago. It's very state-of-the-art, and they pride themselves on an amazing feat, having built enough women's toilets so there's never a queue for the women's loos. However,
Thank goodness for
which
that.
is that is progress, that is the cultural revolution. But there was a huge power cut in the middle of their flagship show.
And they had
it
to
was
use the men's. No. On that note, got to stop, running out of time. I'll let you finish that story properly next time. Let's check out the weather. It's windy. Anyway, it's windy.